Hollywood is facing its first industry-wide shutdown in more than 60 years, with actors officially headed to the picket line. On Friday, roughly 160,000 actors went on strike for the first time in 43 years, saying they were fed up with unfair pay and working conditions. The members of the Screen Actors Guild, American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, joined 11,500 already striking screenwriters who walked out back in May over similar concerns, including the threat of artificial intelligence. The failed negotiations with the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers means film and television productions featuring actors will immediately halt, essentially shutting down Hollywood. It'll be the first talent strike in the industry since 1960. And joining me now is Russ Kane. Thank you very much for joining us. You're a broadcaster. Walk us through what led these actors and writers to go on strike. What are they demanding?
Well, here's the thing. They started negotiating. Thank you so much for having me on the show, by the way. I really appreciate it here in London. They started negotiating over 6 weeks ago with the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. That looks after most of the Hollywood studios. And just to remind you who they would be, that's Discovery, Warner, NBC, Universal, Paramount, Sony, Netflix, Amazon, Apple, and Disney. They need more money. And I'd be honest with you, I'm supposed to be dispassionate, but I'm not. In this case, I think they're 100% correct. Over the last 10 years, their earnings as a writer, and remember, you don't have any shows unless you've got a writer. You're going to stand there looking at a blank screen.
Absolutely.
So their earnings have dropped by 23%. Let that sink in, 23%. The business model that writers worked on has gone. Because now, instead of the movie industry being the important thing, as you know, and I'm sure it's the same where you are, it's the streaming service, it's the Netflix, it's the Amazon, it's the Hulu, it's all of those streaming services. Those deals are really quite different. So it's a perfect storm. There's several things that are happening all at one time. Number one, you have what they call writing rooms, literally where the writers would get together. Now, in the old model, let's say you had a series, I don't know, any television series that you particularly like, you'd have a large writing room, a big group of writers, and those shows would go on for several seasons. Some of them would go on for, I don't know, if you take...
The Sopranos went on for years.
Law and Order, right? 20 years plus. Something like Law and Order, 20 years plus. And you'd have writers continue. Now, because of streaming and binge watching, which I'm sure you're familiar with that is, the actual showing, the broadcasting of these series is much, much shorter. That's number one. So your income has dropped dramatically. Instead of 20 years, you might have 6 weeks, if you're lucky. Number two, they are closing down the writers' rooms, making it much, much smaller. So it's much harder to get a job, number one, and you're going to be paid less, number two. Number three, the big, big problem are residuals. Now, most writers, same as actors, but most writers make their money when these shows are shown on what they call syndication. So let's say it went out on CBS, I'm picking anything at random, doesn't matter, a CBS network in America, then it would go to the local affiliates, et cetera, et cetera. They would be getting income for many, many years. Those deals are now awful. And some writers are showing their paychecks from these residuals, and I'm not joking, they range from 2 cents to 19 cents. Nobody can live on that. Plus, adding to this perfect storm is artificial intelligence, AI. In other words, actors, which is why they're involved, you could take their likeness, like in the new series of Black Mirror by the genius Charlie Brooker, with Jane is Awful. You take their likeness, with or without their permission, that's another gray area, and you shove them into shows. So they're not making any money at all. That's putting it in a very crude way. So all of these different factors are meaning that the pay is being squeezed, and they've had enough. They need a new business model. That's the basis of why there's a strike.
So tell me,
terms, I can get it.
As you mentioned, this is the largest strike in Hollywood since the 1960s. How is it affecting the industry as a whole? And what will be the ripple effect of this?
Well, I'll answer it simply. There's no industry. The industry stopped. End of. There's no ifs, there's no buts. You cannot write or work on any show, any TV show, any movie, finished. It's not happening. What is the ripple effect? Well, the streaming services, we're talking about entertainment, not talking about news, obviously, because that goes on, but the streaming services will have a stockpile of shows. That's pretty guaranteed. They're going to have a stockpile of shows. That could last, let's say, 6 months. After that, you're going to have to go into reruns. Nothing can be filmed. Everything has to be stopped. And by the way, in case you're thinking, well, I tell you what, I don't really agree with this strike. I'll come in as a writer. No, you will be blackballed for life. Not only will you be blackballed, highly likely, almost guaranteed, the entire production would be blackballed and won't be shown and will be subject to all sorts of ghastly legislation and, and litigation. So the industry has literally ground to a halt. Nothing's happening. Nothing.